What if you grew up in a belief system that told you everything around you was an illusion? What if you were told everything that happened to you, from being sick to stubbing a toe to being bullied at school, was your fault for not knowing the truth? What if you were denied even the most basic health care, from pain pills to checkups to vaccinations? How do you unravel yourself from this belief system? And what happens when you do? My name is Hillary Alexander, and this is Leaving Christian Science. Welcome to episode 7 of Leaving Christian Science. My guest today is Cara, who is a licensed clinical social worker who also happens to be an ex-Christian Scientist. So I thought that would be a really interesting perspective, since so far we've just had people talking about their experiences, but who don't really have training in the psychological processes of coming out of groups like this, of being able to process your childhood experiences. So it'll be good to have a professional here today. So welcome, Cara.
Thank you.
And why don't we start in our usual way, which is just talking about when Christian Science first entered your family history. How far back does it go for you?
Yeah. So on my father's side, I am third generation. My father's mother entered Christian Science and brought her husband and my dad with her. I believe she found it not too long before my dad was born. She had been raised Jewish, and so that she was part of that movement from Judaism to Christian Science in the middle 20th century. And on my mother's side, it was my maternal great grandmother who found Christian Science. And of course, I never met her. She passed long before I was born, but she passed it along, and that whole side of the family was Christian Scientists.
So did your parents meet in a Christian Science environment, or
They
was it
did.
coincidental?
They did. They met at association.
Okay.
So they both had the same teacher for class instruction. I believe it took place in Boston, which, Christian Science and Boston go together like hand in glove.
Yeah.
And I don't think they took class at the same time, but they met at the association. So yeah, that's how they met.
So growing up, would you consider yourself to have been in a radical Reliance household?
No.
Okay.
And that's been an interesting part of kind of my journey out, like, and getting into the ex-Christian Scientist groups, is realizing just how much we were not radical Reliance as compared to a lot of people. Because people are talking about their first medical experiences in their 20s and things like that. And my parents, actually the whole family that I knew, would go to doctors in what they would deem as an emergency. So for example, my grandmother, my mom's mom, I know had surgery for cancer. Turned out to be, I believe, uterine cancer, is the best I understand it. Of course, we don't have a whole lot of information. Even when there is medical care, it's not good, complete information. My mother's brother was hit by a car when he was in college, and got some medical care, but did not complete the course of treatment that they recommended. My mother's father died in a hospital. Turned out it was colon cancer. Once again, the misinformation on medical, I thought for years that he had died of lung cancer because he worked in a factory. But and then towards the end of her life, my mother told me no, that it had been colon cancer.
Yeah.
Um,
So I'm interested in a family that was so multi-generational and
uh,
uh went to class instruction and all that. Was there ever any discussion about the decision to get medical care? Like, what was the attitude about the medical world?
the medical world, I would say, it was weird to me looking back at it, because for both my parents, there seemed to be this unspoken but very clear understanding that the medical world could help with physical maladies.
Mhm.
They just, there really wasn't any doubt with them. Um, when my brother fell and broke his leg, they took him to the emergency room, no questions asked. Um, things like that.
I mean, do you
Um,
think they had any guilt about it or no?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think there was a lot of guilt and shame, that we did it. Um, but it was only in emergencies,
Right.
what they deemed to be an emergency. Um, and so I think they kind of excused themselves because they weren't like going to a doctor regularly or things like that.
Yeah, I remember there was this, I'm sure you've heard this term, this very derogatory term towards Christian scientists that occasionally dip their foot into medical care. It was called being a teabag Christian scientist. Did you ever hear that?
Not until the XCS groups I had
Yeah.
heard
So
it.
what that is, for people who don't know, is a teabag Christian scientist, which is only works when it's in hot water.
Yeah.
And for a family like mine, who, despite not saying they were radical Reliance, actually were, we would always sort of judge and look down on any Christian scientists we knew that did get
Yes.
medical care. And
Yeah.
even to the point of, because obviously we knew a handful of people that endured, cancer treatments and things like that in our Christian Science world.
Mhm.
And, my mother always had this attitude about it, like,
Okay.
well, they just weren't trying hard enough, or the other, my other favorite, which was, some sin they had committed, even though the word sin was never used, like
Right.
something this person had done that was sort of less than savory, and that's why they had cancer. And, if
Right.
they didn't deal with that, then they would never get better. And I mean, it was just
Right.
this terrible, arrogant judgment of anyone who, like,
Oh,
deign to actually get physical help for a physical ailment. It was just terrible.
yes. Oh, yes, definitely. And I think we felt that from other members of our church. Um, definitely. And lots of shame, and um on top of the shame about seeking medical care, which of course gets complicated with the child cases. I was born in 1971, so as I'm growing up and as my siblings are growing up, the child cases where all the kids had died under the care of practitioners and stuff, were very much in the news. So of course
Yeah.
there's kind of less shame in a sense about going to seek medical care for your children because you don't want to become one of the child cases. So it's a very complicated um, situation there. And yet my parents and our family definitely felt um, definitely felt the shaming, about the fact that we did seek medical care. Um, and on top of it, my parents were never good with money.
Mm,
Um, they were both teachers. So they never made that much money in the first place. As we know, teachers are some of the most underpaid folks in the country. And they were bad with the money they had. So We weren't poor. We had a house over our, we had a roof over our head. We had food. We had decent clothes, but you've having been to Christian Science churches, you've probably witnessed, like, it's not just wear decent clothes. This is not a church you go to in jeans and sweatshirts like a lot of churches these days. It's dress up in your finest every Sunday. Well, we were looked down upon for being kind of shabby,
Mm.
as well as for seeking medical care. So not only were we not demonstrating physical healing, we were not demonstrating supply.
Right. And that's where Christian science very interestingly intersects with prosperity gospel to me.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I've mentioned on this podcast before the sort of very white, very affluent
Yes.
aspect of Christian science. And I yeah, I would definitely say we were not at all affluent. We were the poor people in every congregation we were in. So this was not me, but there's definitely a what's wrong with them that they're not demonstrating supply attitude for
And,
sure. Yeah,
and
which is
our
horrible.
family definitely felt that, you know.
Yeah,
It,
the snobbery
oh yeah,
that you're
like,
somehow again a sinner without using that word
yeah,
for being
that
poor.
you're not a good Christian Scientist if you're not wealthy somehow.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll relate to the child cases also to call back to that. You and I are about the same age, and I think our generation, those cases loomed really large for
Yes.
us. I mean, that was a huge thing that was happening in the 80s and 90s, and I think it's what fueled a lot of my mother's paranoia about people finding out that we weren't going to doctors. You know, she was always sort of hushing me and telling me to not tell people and to keep things private, and
Mhm.
she was very afraid that somebody would come and like take me away basically if they found out that she wasn't taking me to doctors. So there was
Mhm.
all this weird paranoia and need to hide things and feeling like people are against us, and
Mhm.
very very paranoid way to grow up. I don't know if
Mhm.
you had that, a feeling of sort of being like against the world in this little group you were in. Did you have that at all?
Somewhat. I don't think quite the same that you did. And I think it really kind of makes me wonder. It's not something I ever spoke with my parents about directly, but it makes me wonder how much of an influence all of that was on their decisions to seek medical care.
Mm,
I know that it was already, you know, they weren't the only members of the family who did.
right.
So I know that there was some kind of mental gymnastics going on, that led to those decisions, but I never got the straight of it. And my mom passed several years ago, and my dad and I don't speak, so
Mm,
I'm not gonna get any answers.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, outside of the medical stuff, which thankfully for you was not a big issue, no medical neglect there. How was it emotionally as far as, your concept of reality, your being allowed to express or experience your feelings as a child?
Um, that was where the real damage happened.
Mm,
Um, there were some, we didn't go to doctors regularly, so there were some cases of neglect on like a smaller scale, medically, but um, emotionally, um, and what I came to understand once I started studying psychology was Christian Science is a recipe for attachment wounding.
mm,
So the science of attachment, um, which at this point is brain science, because we do have the ability to scan the brain, and to understand more about what's going on in the brain. Um, the human brain, like most mammal brains, is wired to develop an attachment with other human beings, right? With other creatures. Um, and so part of that needs to look like having your caregivers um like help explain what your emotions are as you're learning, as you're feeling them, as you're learning language.
Yeah.
Your caregivers should be helping to explain what your emotions are. Oh, you fell down and hurt yourself. That was probably scary. You're probably scared and it hurts. You're feeling
Mm.
pain. Oh, your friend took your toy. You're probably mad. You know, helping to talk through that and understand what you're feeling, and having those emotions validated is an essential part of brain development
Yeah.
and developing a healthy self-concept. And by doing the exact opposite of that, Christian Scientists just wreck their child's emotional development.
Wow. Yeah.
um you don't understand yourself, you don't trust yourself, the potential for so many things to go wrong in your development of a self concept.
And what kind of effects would something like that have later in life? Like, how does a childhood like that affect you?
um so it affects your relationships, your ability to form a healthy attachment to another person, because you haven't had a healthy attachment with your primary caregivers. You're going to have a really hard time forming a healthy attachment to anyone else. um in my case, it was a lot of anxiety,
Yeah.
um needing a lot of reassurance, and yet being afraid to ask for it. So there's three types of insecure attachment. um is anxious attachment, where you're seeking reassurance all the time. Avoidant attachment, where you don't trust and so you just pull away. And then disorganized attachment. And disorganized attachment is when it is generally the result of abuse and or neglect. And I believe that's about where I ended up.
Mm.
Because and I think probably quite a few Christian Scientists, because we would get, in a lot of cases, our parents would love us, or one of our parents might be really nurturing, or they might be nurturing sometimes. They might, about certain things, they might be really supportive and nurturing, and then other things they're just cold
Yeah.
and invalidating, and consistently so. And so when you have a disorganized attachment, you're going to show some signs of the avoidance and some signs of the anxiety. And so it can be very confusing to others in your life. What if, how can I please you? What can I do to have a good relationship with you? And the person who grew up that way has no idea, because they haven't had a secure relationship. They don't know what it looks like.
Yeah. I definitely consider myself in that latter group because I also had a mother who was super supportive in some ways and then super not in others. And it was very inconsistent, and you never knew who you were going to get each day. And it was a very insecure and anxiety producing
Mhm,
environment to grow up in. I've
mhm,
talked on here about how during the period where she and I were alone, because my older sister's 10 years older than me. So I was alone for a good part of my childhood with my mother because my father was gone.
mhm.
And I had terrible trichotillomania when I was in junior high school,
Yeah.
anxiety. And I always think about like, well, it just kind of went away one day. It just stopped. And I realized, oh, the day it stopped was when I moved away from her.
Yes.
When I stopped living with my mother and moved in with my now adult sister, suddenly the trichotillea magically went away.
Yeah. The major source of your anxiety wasn't there anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And my mother was widely considered one of the sweetest, most kind and loving people that most people ever met. She was um she was a wonderful person. But she didn't have a backbone
Mm,
until very, very close to the end of her life. Um, she didn't develop a backbone. And my dad walked all over her. Um, he, I will not diagnose my father. I could, but I won't. Um, but he had a lot of narcissistic traits, very overbearing, um, would browbeat my mom and me and anybody and everybody into things. And so I had my disorganization was partly that mom's reaction to things was to shut down and to go hide in a book, not the books. Therefore, bad Christian Scientist, right? Um, but she'd go hide her nose in a book, and dad would lecture endlessly about whatever was on his mind, not necessarily anything I did, but whatever his worries were. And I wonder, he wouldn't say in so many words usually, something like malicious animal magnetism or things like that, but how was he like, knowing the Christian Science things, like him lecturing me about all these horrible things that could happen. Like, wow, he must have really like not been able to reconcile that with the beliefs about how, if you're thinking it, it will appear.
Yeah.
That it really it makes me wonder just how little control he had over himself. Both my parents, once they left CS, they left in the 90s, around the same time I did. They both were diagnosed with various mental illnesses. Um, so those were undoubtedly going on during CS years, but yeah, the those were the big wounds for me. I didn't have like lasting physical disability, but having that really walking on eggshells around dad and mom being the sweetest person, but not being helpful when dad would go on a tear. That was where I ended up. And of course, none of it gets dealt with because it's all an error in your thinking
Right.
instead of something that you would get help with.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say for me, one of the minor, but still, as it turns out, pretty important negative effects of having grown up in a Christian Science household is the complete lack of conflict resolution skills.
Yes. Yes.
The problem, quote unquote, isn't real.
Right.
So to spend any time on it is like not Christian Science-ly.
Right.
And
Right.
B, even if we did try to talk about our issues with each other, it would have been done in a weird Christian science-y way where you're not really acknowledging the things and
Mhm.
you're trying to I don't even know. Like I don't even know how we would have attempted this, but it never occurred to me that you can have a disagreement or an argument with a loved one and actually work through it and give each other a hug afterwards and say, I'm really glad we talked about that. Like that just was something that would never happen in our family at all.
Right. Right. And it's interesting, like having worked as a therapist for a few years now, I'm finding like a lot of people don't have great skills in things like conflict resolution and working through things with loved ones. But it's not usually institutionalized.
Right.
It's it's just, generationally they didn't learn the skills or whatever. So like one of the things that struck me about Christian Science is it's kind of like a lot of the issues with America that I see, like the unrealistic amount of individualism that our
Yeah.
country pushes people towards. um that's such a Christian Science, like Christian Science takes that to the nth degree. Go into your room with your books and work it all out for yourself, and it pushes you to that individualism. And of course we're relational creatures, we need each other. And so trying to learn to relate to each other successfully, resolve conflict successfully, have a genuine attachment to somebody is so hard
Yeah.
when you're hiding things, anything that might be wrong, you're hiding it and holding it back. It just, yeah, it's a
Yeah.
recipe for horrible relationships.
Yeah. And you're not allowed to ask for help. You're supposed to help yourself.
Mhm.
Even
And
as a
then,
little kid, you're supposed to help yourself and just somehow know how
yeah,
to do that.
yeah. And if you go to a practitioner, what you tend to get is not actual help. It's it's whatever they can, at least as I remember it, whatever they can pull, usually from this week's lesson,
Right.
that relates in any way whatsoever to what you've brought to them. And they'll tell you, go to section 4 of the lesson and study, the science and health from page 325, and and once you come to a full understanding of that, you'll just feel all better.
Yeah. I think people who don't, non ex Christian scientists who listen to this will probably be interested to know what actually happens when you call a practitioner, because we keep using this term. And, so basically a practitioner is like a Christian Science doctor. They're somewhere else. So you're always calling them on the phone. You're not like visiting them typically, I don't think. I certainly never did.
I wonder
Um,
if they do Zoom calls now.
yeah, good question. Probably.
Wow.
Because when I was a kid, if things got really bad, either physically or mentally or whatever, I would call practitioners, and it's exactly as you said. They would refer you to some paragraph or some Bible thing, and you would just sort of go off and study it by yourself. And I remember, I mean, obviously, I believed in it at the time, and it did seem to help some of the time, although some of the times it didn't. And I remember reading these things and really feeling something, like genuinely, I'm not making this up. Like I would
Yeah.
seem to get some incredible insight. Like,
Yes.
wow, I never looked at it that way before. That's so true.
Mhm.
Which to me is very similar to looking at a horoscope,
Yes.
being like, wow, that's exactly what happened today. That's so true.
Yes. Yes. Well,
Like,
and
is
that's
it
partly
really?
just,
Or is it just, so broad that it could apply to
yeah.
anything?
Yeah. Yeah. That's really part of what it is, probably. But it's also, I mean, there's been some talk in the XCS group, and I think part of it, what comes into it, is the placebo effect.
Yeah.
You know, you're getting this tiny little bit of validation that something's wrong, because as a child, your parent or guardian has called a practitioner, so it shows you, okay, they're taking me a little bit seriously, so they're going to this expert to get me help.
Yeah,
And
and just the
so,
acknowledgement alone is very powerful because you're so used to not being
yes,
acknowledged in any way.
yes. But then, like, um one of the things that seems to be part of the benefit of any kind of prayerful or meditative practice, um not the whole benefit, but at least part of it, is um that you are focusing your mind on something, which often will relax your body. So any tension that you're holding, which might be increasing pain, is gonna relax some. So that may be an actual effect of like focusing your mind on whatever the practitioner has referred you to. Is I'm so busy thinking about this that I can't think about how much whatever this is hurts, so my body starts to relax a little bit, and maybe it doesn't hurt quite as much as it did before. So it doesn't solve the problem, but you may feel some reduction of pain.
Yeah, and I think that happened enough in my childhood that that's what kept me going, is referring back to these instances. And plus all the stories like we've talked about on here a lot, like the entire fruitage chapter in Science and Health and the
Yeah.
100 years of Christian Science healing,
Yeah.
all these stories plus your own sort of random small
Yes.
moments of
Yes.
kind of feeling better once you've relaxed and regulated your breathing and done a little prayer, which is really
Mhm.
just kind of like meditation, really.
Yep.
Suddenly you feel just a little bit better. And then eventually you do get better because you would have gotten better anyway. And then suddenly that's a healing,
Yes.
you know?
Yeah.
That cold I had for a week,
It
finally got
healed.
better. Woo! Healing.
Yeah.
Testimony. There we go.
When I fell down and skinned my knee, it healed. Yeah,
Yeah.
it gets
Magical.
better. That's what our bodies do.
So did you have a very Christian Science environment? Like were you in schools and camps and things like that as a kid?
So part of being completely broke was that I never went to the camps. My parents didn't have the money to do any of that. Um, and so my first experience of being in an environment was my grandmother, my mom's mom, because my dad's parents were both dead by the time I was 3. So my mom's mom was very much in my life. Um, she took me to the summer session at Principia College, um, and for a couple of years while I was in high school. And I absolutely fell in love with the campus. It is, I don't know if you've ever been, but it is gorgeous.
Mm.
Um, these beautiful buildings sitting in this like wooded area at the top of the bluffs of the Mississippi with a view where on a clear day you can see the arch in St. Louis. I mean, it's gorgeous. It's a beautiful place. Of course, I fell in love with it.
Yeah.
Um, and that was the first time that I was ever in an environment that was, other than at church, that was Christian Science based. And I decided I wanted to go to the college. And so that was the only college I applied to.
Wow.
My my parents were pretty worried about that. But it was the only college I applied to. Straight out of high school, and that's where I went. And I went there for 4 years and graduated. Um and and um my dad didn't want to let me go. And the way I talked him into it was I said, "Dad, I want to go there so that I can become a better Christian Scientist."
Hmm.
And he was worried about how much it was going to cost and me being so far away, and that won him over. um
Was
but
that true or were you just saying that?
there was some truth to it.
Yeah.
But mostly I just wanted to get away from him,
Yeah.
and go live in that really beautiful place that I had loved spending summers in. So um yeah, it was like probably 75-25, right? I had some like I had some inkling that I wanted to become a better Christian Scientist, but mostly I just wanted the hell out of Cincinnati. So
Yeah. And so tell us about Principia, because again, I did not go there. I don't really have any connection to the place, but I certainly know a lot of people who did. So what was that like? Was it kind of a normal college experience? Was there a lot of Christian Science-y stuff that happened there? What was it really like?
um it's interesting because um everybody there was supposedly a Christian Scientist, had been raised in Christian Science anyway, and yet it was probably the experience of being there is probably what started me down the road of leaving Christian Science.
Mm,
Um, you didn't have to join the Christian Science organization at the college. There was a Christian Science organization, but you didn't have to join it, and I never did. Um, I very rarely went to church services.
hmm.
I was usually out too late on Saturday nights to want to drag myself out of bed on Sunday mornings. Um, and Wednesday testimony meetings, no, I never liked those. And I very, very rarely drug myself to those. Thing I would go to, and probably, from the times I did go to services, probably the most well attended thing that I saw were hymn sings.
Well, yeah.
And I always loved singing hymns. I always loved singing.
Yeah, me too.
Um, and I forget what night it was. It might have been Sunday nights. I don't know. But once a week they would have a hymn sing in the chapel. Big gorgeous organ. And they would, you could put in requests, and they would take requests from the room, and because the organist he was amazing. He knew everything in the book and could play it just without even a hesitation.
Yeah.
And we would sing hymns, and
Oh,
that was,
gentle presence. Here we go.
yeah. And so it was, that was my most, like, the most I participated. um yeah, I found that there wasn't a whole lot of talk about Christian Science at the Christian Science College.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was interesting. Um, and so I just drifted farther and farther away. There was a half hour every weekday morning that was supposed to be devoted to reading the lesson, but I never had a roommate. Well, maybe not never, very rarely anyway, had a roommate who actually read their lesson during
Wow.
that half hour. Yeah. And one roommate, one of my really good friends, we would we would sit and watch reruns of All Guy, I think it was, during that half hour.
A lot more interesting. Yeah.
Yes. Um, so yeah, it was, I don't know that it was an absolutely normal college experience. It's so different than my other college experiences, which I got 3 bachelor's degrees. That was my first bachelor's degree. I got 2 more because I didn't know what the heck to do with my life.
Mm.
Um, but I went to Kansas State University after, which is a huge, I don't know, like 20,000 students, as opposed to Principia, which was like, I believe, less than 600 even when I went there.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it was so small.
Somewhere around that size. So it, the same but different, going to other colleges, because Prin was so tiny and isolated. That's
Yeah.
the other thing. Like, uh, most other colleges are pretty close to some kind of town and have like bus service or something so you can get to town. If you didn't have your own car at Principia, you can't get anywhere.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's out in the middle of nowhere.
Hmm.
The little tiny town at the base of the bluffs called Elsa. At the time, it was a couple hundred people. I don't think there was even a convenience store down there. And it was probably like from the actual dorms, it was probably at least 3 miles to walk, which of course you're not gonna,
You're not gonna do. Yeah.
yeah. So you're completely isolated. There's nothing.
Wow.
Um, so yeah, it's thinking back on that, it's kind of terrifying. Um, yeah.
So
Um,
when you were a kid, I mean, you obviously started to you feel like Principia was kind of the part where you just drifted out entirely. When you were a kid, were you really would you say you were like really into it? Were you just sort of going along? Did you have moments of sort of questioning or pushing back?
I think um I I was trying to understand because the way I always understood it was that in order to have a healing, in order to, in order to get better from anything, you had to understand the Bible and science and health. That was the way I always interpreted it. And so I always was like, I would read and try to understand it, and I never could. And of course not, because it's gobbledygook.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that when I was a kid. I just thought I hadn't understood it yet. So I think that was where I kind of lived for the longest time, was that I just haven't understood it yet. Because my parents weren't super devout, clearly, or devoted, but my grandmother was. She was really, really dedicated. Um, so my mom's parents were first and second reader at our church when I was little. Um, and and basically up until my grandfather got too sick, I think. Um, and then my grandmother continued to be a reader with others. And then later in her life, she was on the board, like including being chair. So she was really like completely, she considered becoming a practitioner.
Mm,
Um, Never followed through with it, but considered it.
yeah. So for
So
people who don't know, first and second reader is really the only kind of authority figures that Christian Science has. People are always surprised when I tell them that we don't have a pastor, like there
right,
isn't this person that sort of leads a church and writes a sermon with their own kind of personal input or interpretation. That's just not a thing that happens. What ends up happening in a Christian Science church service is there's a first reader and a second reader who just get up and read this Bible and science and health lesson, quote unquote, that you've been reading all week. So you read this thing every single day. And then these people who I think are elected, aren't they sort of elected
yes,
by yeah,
yeah,
so they're elected by the group to be the first and second reader, and they just read you what you've been reading all week. And that's
right,
it. That's the whole church service. So there's
right.
no, and I always thought this was a good thing that there was no sort of personal
I
slant.
did too. Yes.
And I took that as a point of pride, like, well, we don't have some guy just kind of
Making it up.
making it up,
Right.
forgetting that we had a woman who made it all
Who
up.
made it up. Yeah. And
Yeah,
that,
so the fact that your
and
grandparents were
yeah,
first and second reader definitely
yeah,
sets off bells in my head of like, oh, they were very important. They were
they were,
very, they were
they
the
were
authority figures
popular.
in that
Mhm.
congregation. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and so I think as I look back at it, like the more time I spent with my grandmother, the harder I was trying. Then when I would be around my parents, they weren't trying that much. And so there was no, like, with my grandmother, if I stayed the night at her place, and then she would read the lesson, and we would read the lesson. She had cassette tapes of me reading the lesson with her, things
Oh.
like that. And but at home with my parents, there was no let's read the lesson. There was none of that. If you were not feeling well, sometimes there would be, well, let's sing a hymn, or let's say the scientific statement of being, or something like that. But I think like being around my grandmother, which I was pretty often, was when I would be more devoted.
Yeah, it sounds like generationally in your family, there's just been a slow pulling away.
Yeah.
Yeah, till finally it gets to you and then it's just out.
Yeah.
Which I think is a very common story actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I unfortunately was raised by an adult convert.
Right.
So she had that adult convert fanaticism that
Yes.
probably wouldn't have existed if it was actually my grandmother that found it in like the 40s or something. And then my
Right.
mother would probably have rebelled against it and I never would have even known about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But it was just kind of the way things were, that in our family, on both sides of my family, was just we're Christian Scientists. That's just what we do. But my parents didn't take it very seriously. One of the things that I was actually surprised to learn when I joined the XCS group was that a lot of people's parents would mute the medicine commercials and refuse to let them watch any kind of medical show.
Yeah. Yeah, we
Um,
did that.
I so this and this is another bad Christian Scientist moment. My my dad loved some of those medical shows. Like there was Quincy with Jack Klugman. He loved that show. We watched some of the other ones. We all loved Star Trek, and Star Trek, it's not all about medical, but there's the medical component, and
Mhm.
medicine in Star Trek is very much like um it's the aspirational. It's like this is where medicine can go in the future, and it's not that we've solved all the problems, but that we have, that we use the tools and we get better, and we learn. And so I think that as far as me and the influence that had on me was like, I think that it contributed to me assuming that, yeah, medicine works, because Quincy knows it works, and Dr. McCoy knows it works, and things. So I I had no question in my mind that medicine was a thing that worked. Christian Science to me was kind of like this special thing. Like, if I can ever figure this thing out, I'm gonna have these wonderful, amazing, miraculous healings. It was like, but if I can't, then I'll,
Well,
if I
that's
break my leg, I'll go to the doctor.
yeah, I mean, it's good that medicine was not demonized for you.
Yeah, I
It
think
definitely
it.
was for me.
Yeah, yeah, and I think like that probably helped a lot as I left. Like, not that I didn't have like the comfortable. I had a family doctor, anything like that. So I wasn't comfortable with the medical system. It had always been emergencies, scary times, um, you know. But at least I had some experience, and I knew that doctors weren't out to get me. You know,
Yeah.
um, I what I do remember is that when my parents would take me to the emergency room, like for when I was about 12, they took me to the emergency room for because I was in a lot of pain, and it turned out to be a urinary tract infection. And the doctor just looked at them like, what is wrong with you people? She has a UTI. Why did you bring her to the emergency room? It's just a UTI. Why didn't you take her to your family doctor? But we didn't
Mm.
have one, of course.
Oh, yeah.
So, that was that was usually what I saw from like medical staff when they would bring me to the emergency room for stuff that wasn't really an emergency. They would be like, what are you doing here?
And would they, I mean, would they ever say that? Would they ever say, well, we don't have a doctor or we're Christian scientists or do you
Oh
know?
yeah, I think that I think they would. I don't think they had shame about it.
Yeah.
Or I don't think they were trying to hide it.
Yeah.
I had the vaccination exemptions at school and all that stuff. Got my vaccinations when I joined the army.
Oh, there you go.
At 28, I got a whole raft of vaccinations in the army.
Yeah, I got all mine at 39, so
Yeah.
right behind you. So tell me about if you think this is an relevant story, the decision to get into therapy as a profession.
Hmm. Um, that came much later. Um, so I didn't decide to do that until after I got out of the army. I served in the army for a little over 10 years, from age 28 to 38-ish.
Hmm.
Um, and then after I got out and realized I had actually earned the GI Bill, I didn't think I was going to have GI Bill money, because I joined to pay off my student loans, some of which were still remaining from Prin, because it's expensive. It's a private school. Um, but I stayed in long enough to earn GI Bill. And so I was like, well, I could go back to school, but what am I going to do? Um, and while I was kind of playing around with the idea, I started taking some art classes, um, and realizing how therapeutic art was for me and how much I was working out by making art. Um, And so I started looking around, well, what could I do with this? Is there like a real, other than just trying to sell my art, is there a career I could do with this? And I found art therapy and I was like,
Hmm.
well, maybe I'll do art therapy. And thank goodness I did an informational interview with an art therapist early in college for that, because what I found out was that it's kind of getting a degree as an art therapist is kind of limiting. Your modalities are kind of slender. um, so I ended up, rather than going strictly that way, social work's a really broad profession. You can do a lot of things with it, and so I chose social work. Um, so I think, noticing that art could heal you was the beginning of it. But then as I was going through the psychology classes that were required, I really started like understanding what had happened to me. I found a book called Leaving the Fold,
Hmm.
which was all about leaving religion. And I started understanding the trauma that the CS had done.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely talk about that. I'm really interested to hear your realizations of exactly what you had been through from a clinical perspective.
yeah. Well, it's interesting because around the time that I was in school, for psychology is the same time that I was getting into the XCS groups on Facebook. And so that all kind of came together and helped me really explore it. Because I hadn't ever like I left Christian Science in the 90s. Um, but 20 years later, I really hadn't like explored what it did to me. I left it behind,
Just walked away and that was it. Yeah.
walked away, didn't and um didn't deal with it. And so as I'm in the XCS group and reading all the stories and all the things that people have been through. Then I started taking psychology classes and understanding about attachment and understanding what gaslighting is and the damage that that does to somebody's psyche. And so it all kind of came together to help me understand that my my own personal background, the type of person my father was, he probably wouldn't have been great for me under any circumstances. Um, but Christian Science excuses everything, or
Yeah.
encourages you to hide everything, to deny anything that might be considered erroneous in Christian Science terms, because anything that's not harmonious is erroneous and is error and therefore isn't real. And so when it finally, I'm sitting as a client in therapy, and my therapist, I'm describing my father and how he treated us, or me in particular. Um, and my therapist just named it as psychological abuse
Mm.
and verbal abuse. I was gobsmacked. I was like, what are you talking about? It's abuse to me at that point was physical. That was,
Yeah, being smacked,
yeah,
basically.
you didn't hit me. What are you talking about?
Yeah,
Like,
for
I
sure.
think in my entire growing up, I think my dad actually spanked me like 3 times. Now, so processing some of that, because it was not, um it was not just a little pat on the butt. um so like, I didn't even realize it for myself until somebody else named it for me. And then once starting to understand that, and reading people's stories in the group where they had been molested by family members or by people in the church, things like that, and then putting together what was going on with my dad, I really realized Christian Science serves as a cover for abusers
Mm.
all too often. And I think it's not alone. Look at the Catholic Church and the history of abuse. Look at, the Pentecostal is bad that way
Yeah.
too. There's all kinds of, and don't get me started on like the LDS church and the way LGBT people are treated in that church.
Yeah.
But there's, but what Christian Science does is not just like the protect the other members of your church like those other churches do, but it's deny the entire reality of what's happening to you
Yeah.
and deny. So it is institutionalized gaslighting. It
Yeah.
is written into it that you are being gaslit from the ground up. Everything, anything that's happening to you, you're just deny it. So it just is unbelievably damaging.
Yeah, there's this one really heartbreaking moment that my mother and I had as we were hurtling towards what I call our divorce, where it was all about I just needed her to comfort me. I just needed her for once to say, "I'm sorry that happened. Are you okay?" And I remember specifically saying, and I think this was over Skype, so it was like face to face. I was like, "Okay, I don't think she understands what I need, so I'm just gonna spell it out." And I remember saying, "I need you to say, 'I'm sorry that happened.'" And she said right back to me, "I can't say that because it wouldn't be truthful." I just can't. I can't
Mhm,
do it. I know that's
mhm,
what you need from me, but I can't say that.
yeah.
And that
So
was
she
kind of the moment I realized that this relationship was not going to be repaired,
yeah,
and she was stuck in this, and I
yep,
just couldn't make myself party to it anymore.
yeah,
This lifetime of denial and inability to offer the slightest empathy or comfort for me or anyone else. It's like
right.
I can't. I just
And
can't
and
anymore.
I think that brings up an important point, like, because I can imagine like people listening to me talk about attachment and what kids need are like in horror of like, oh my gosh, I've messed up my own kids because I'm not always perfectly validating of them. No, that's not
Right.
the case. What you offered your mom was the opportunity for repair.
Yeah.
And we all make mistakes. We're all human. You don't have to be perfect to be a good parent. You don't have to get it right the first time, but you do need to be willing to go back and make a repair and say, I'm sorry that I used that tone with you.
Hmm.
I was upset and I shouldn't have talked to you that way. The reason I got upset was because this, and so that's what we need to deal with. Parents need to be able to do that repair, and your mom couldn't do it because Christian Science denial. She's denying the reality of what's hurting you
Yeah. And it
instead
just
of
goes to
dealing with it.
the issue of that Elizabeth talked about, which was Christian Science forcing people to choose the ideology over relationships and prioritizing
Oh yeah,
the ideology over a relationship. And that's just terrible.
yeah,
And again, not the only group or religion to do that, certainly, but
right. And that's like, and as I work with a lot of people who have been through some kind of abuse. It's basically become my specialty as a therapist. Not religious abuse in particular, but some of my clients have had some of those factors involved. And yeah, it's everywhere. It's just that Christian Science takes it to a particular place. Like I watched like the Leah Remini specials about Scientology, and I was like, yeah, I see some parallels there
yeah,
for
me
sure.
too. Yes,
Um,
Scientology was my first interest. I think probably because of that show and a couple of podcasts. And as much as, obviously Christian Science is not Scientology, but
we
there's
get mistaken for it so
we get
much.
mistaken for it constantly, which kind of cracks me up and annoys me at the same time. But yeah, the not so much the physicality of being in Scientology, which is very, very different, but the philosophy is kind of similar.
Yeah.
They do prioritize the group over their personal relationships. They
Oh,
do deny negativity and put it out of their minds. And,
yes.
I've heard stories of children growing up in it that just like us, when they get sick or when they get hurt, they're kind of made to go
Yep.
by themselves and think about what they did to make that happen and how it's not really happening. And I was like, oh my God, it really is
Yeah.
like Christian Science.
There's frightening similarities. I always found it kind of funny. Like once I learned more about Scientology, after I left CS, I pretty quickly became atheist because I couldn't imagine going to any other Christian religion or any other religion. But I had a theory for a while because I kind of went down I watched a lot of the UFO specials um that were really popular in the 90s.
Hmm.
And I was like, it hit me one day and I went with it for years and joked about it. It was always mostly a joke, like 75% a joke at least. Jesus was an alien hybrid. Mary was abducted and impregnated by aliens. That's what happened. It was almost always mostly a joke, but there was that little part of me that was still trying to figure out if I believed something.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it was my very irreverent, blasphemous thing that I believe. And when I heard about Scientology and it's this alien, when
All
you get
about
to that certain
aliens.
level and they tell you about the alien, I was like, oh wow, so there's that.
Yeah, my mother was obsessed with UFOs and abductions. She had a whole bookcase full of books about it. Yep, obsessed.
Mhm. Yeah, I was very, very interested in the idea that aliens had come to Earth, the all the theories that like the Nazca lines were to signal aliens or things like that. I was very interested in all that stuff for a while.
Yeah. Well, your brain has to go somewhere,
Yeah,
you know,
yes,
especially when you're sort of used to magical thinking. It's hard to
yes.
unravel that and just come to like what I consider to be the cold hard facts, which is like
Yeah,
nothing is magical.
right, right. And that we don't know everything.
Yeah.
That
And that's hard
as
to admit.
yeah, as a species, we don't know everything.
Yeah.
And that's, we're still learning. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So do you it sounds like you because of your background you do have this sort of special understanding of people that grew up in groups like this on
To an extent, yeah.
an
To
extent.
an extent.
Yeah,
Yeah,
more than like someone who'd never experienced it, I
right,
guess. Yeah.
right, right.
Do you find it cathartic in any way or healing to sort of be able to help people with the
Oh,
same issues?
yeah, absolutely. Like to and also oddly, like, I've worked with somebody who was still participating in like Jehovah's Witness, which I think, has some similar qualities. Um, but was having a positive experience of it, and it was
Mm,
actually support to them. Who knows whether that'll continue for them or not. But and to be able to, where somebody who had never been inside of this that type of environment might have had a hard time understanding. I was like, no, I can see why you're seeing this as supportive right now.
yeah.
There was a time when I saw Christian Science as supportive to me. So, okay, meet you where you are, and
Yeah. It's community, I mean,
yeah,
that's the thing we need more than anything else as
yeah,
humans.
yeah, and
Community.
Christian Science gives you so little of
Yeah.
it. That was something at the college, I think, was that there was more of a sense of community than I had had in any other Christian Science experience.
Yeah, for sure.
Because you're going through classes together and you're getting ready for a play together and you're whatever you're doing, you're building community. So that was definitely a positive. I made a lot of really good friends there.
Yeah, I mean, I've often told this story on this podcast, but when I first came to Los Angeles by myself when I was 20, the only person I knew was a Christian Scientist friend of, I think, my sister's that we had known through a church in New York who had moved out here. And without her and her group of friends who were all Principia graduates, like I never would have made it here. I mean, they didn't know me from Adam. They took me in, they taught me how to drive, they helped me get my first job. I
Wow.
owe them a lot, you
Yeah.
know, and I
Yeah.
don't know where any of them are now.
Right.
But that was, again, like for you, for me, the first time I really felt, oh, this is what a church community does. It helps people and it, got
Mhm.
me a place to live. I moved into this large house where, roommates were all Christian Scientists of different ages and it was really
Mhm.
inexpensive and they helped
Mhm.
each other. I mean, it was great. That's
Yeah.
what churches should be about
It
and often are, you know?
yeah. It was a very weird. It brings up a really weird memory that so my degree from Principia was in art history, and one of the members of my church in Cincinnati at the time was actually the curator of the Cincinnati Art Museum. Not once did that person offer me any support. Like, hey, you want to come volunteer at the museum? You want an internship at the museum? Nothing, nothing. Like that should have would talk to me about what I was studying, in the little social hour after services and stuff. But like looking back at that, like that should have been a no-brainer. Why don't I offer Cara, something at the art museum? You know,
Yeah.
And it apparently didn't even occur to him. So just not in the material world, I guess, that it really, and I didn't think to ask for it because I didn't understand the importance of something like that, because in 4 years of going to the college, the professors did not impress upon us the importance of getting some kind of internship in pursuing a career with that
Mm,
degree. And when I left, I was screwed.
yeah, it
I
sounds like
tried
they
to apply to
neglected.
grad school and I couldn't get into grad school because I hadn't had an internship.
Oh boy, they kind of neglected practical
Yes.
advice, and I wonder if that's a Christian Science thing.
I wonder too. I
Yeah,
wonder. Yeah.
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 It's almost like if the person had offered you some kind of help, it would be admitting that there was lack,
Yeah.
you know?
Something's not just going to fall into my lap, and I'm not going to demonstrate the need
Right.
for an internship somehow.
Yeah. Or you have to like work out your own demonstration.
It was
Whatever.
bizarre.
So I think we'll wrap up pretty soon. Is there anything we haven't covered or anything you'd like to bring up?
Um, hmm. Um, I can't think of anything in particular. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and
Cover
I'm
the
always willing
bases.
to come back for another round if you
Yeah.
have questions for me or
Yeah.
anything.
All
Yeah.
right, so I will ask the final questions, which are: would you consider Christian Science a cult?
I'm certainly no expert on cults. Most of what I've learned from other members of the XCS groups. um, and the little bit of reading I've done. But from what I've seen there, I'm pretty well convinced that Christian Science meets most of the requirements. Um, Even the fact that Mary Baker Eddy is long dead, like, because she wrote herself into eternal leadership of the church,
Yeah.
basically, she remains the leader. So I think in a lot of ways it meets a lot of the description of what a cult is. Um, and then definitely the Mrs. Eddy, as we all like ritually seem to call her.
Yeah.
She definitely had that iron fist on the church, and it remains to this day. So in that way, I think it does. That definitely during her lifetime, it, but I think in some ways it still does.
Yeah, that's been something kind of a new concept to me since I've been doing this podcast, is just because your charismatic leader is deceased doesn't mean they're not still very much
Um,
present.
I
Yeah.
mean, I think Scientology still has some of the same issues too,
Oh
even
yeah.
though L. Ron Hubbard is long dead too, like because of the way the structure was put in place. So yeah, I don't think the lack of a living charismatic leader um excuses Christian Science at all.
Yeah. Yeah. So then on that note, do you consider her a true believer or a, I don't know if I should use the word shyster, but that's the only word that
I,
comes
I
to
actually
mind.
I actually went and looked it up when you sent me the questions. I went and looked it up just to make sure I knew. I had a general sense of the word, but I wanted to make sure I knew what it meant. Um,
I guess a con woman would be a better
right,
term to use.
right, and I think I agree with a lot of the others who have been on so far, that there's probably elements of both to her. That she wanted something to be true,
Mhm.
probably, but eventually, if it was true at the beginning, I think eventually it all became a lot about the money. And she was, what I would say she definitely was a hypocrite. Um, because she, writing, that the way to heal is Christian Science, and that if you mix Christian Science and medical care, you're screwing it up, and then using morphine and whatever else she was doing. But the thing that I noticed about that was, like, I didn't know most of that stuff while I was in. I learned most of that stuff about her after I left. I learned I learned a lot from Mark Twain's Christian Science. Oh my gosh, that was a really interesting little book.
Yeah, I need
Mark
to
Twain,
reread that. It's been a while.
yeah, Mark Twain being who he was, he had quite a way of, taking her apart piece by piece. Um, but then God's Perfect Child by is that by Fraser, I think, was the other one.
Caroline Fraser. Yeah.
Caroline Fraser's book really helped to break a lot of things down for me and help me understand how messed up Mrs. Eddy was. um, um, so yeah, I think especially towards the end, she met a lot of the qualities of a shyster. Um, she was just trying to make money off of people.
So I think it's a pretty good consensus that Mary Baker Eddy may have had some, good intentions at one point, but that things kind of went south. I think a lot of us
Yeah,
sort of are on that mindset. Yeah.
yeah, and I think it's pretty clear that she didn't play us straight. She, like like just I've learned enough since leaving that she was, maybe some of it was real, but from the beginning things weren't quite above board. So yeah,
Yeah, and definitely not as they were represented later. Like this whole thing of her fall on the ice that she
right,
supposedly miraculously healed herself of, that was the entire origin story of Christian Science, and yet I just came to learn never actually appeared in that first edition of Science and Health.
right,
Things like
right,
that kind of make you go, hmm.
right. So lots of stuff that, yeah, she she was a fake. Um, and I think once she figured out she could make money, then she just kept going.
Kept going. Yeah, and as another guest pointed out, it was probably the only thing she could do
Yeah, I mean,
professionally, for money.
limited options available to women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We're better off now,
Yeah.
but certainly there's plenty of room left for things to improve for women in our society, but we're much better off now.
Yeah.
So yeah, she did what she could with what she had. And that's one of the things I appreciated in Mark Twain's book, was like there was a grudging admiration for what she had pulled off.
Grudging admiration. I love that.
Um,
That's what I
like
should call this podcast, I guess. Maybe not. I don't think many of us admire her that much.
no,
But yeah,
no,
having pulled something off, definitely.
yeah,
She did pull something off. And for a long time, I mean, look, it's been, 114
yeah,
years almost now since she died, and it's shockingly still going. So,
yeah.
hey, that's quite a
Yeah.
legacy.
Unlike the Quakers, she didn't completely forbid us from having sex, but she certainly gave us like some major shame around it. So
Yeah, that too. And yet we managed to reproduce, some of
yeah,
us anyway, despite all of the shaming. Yeah.
yeah.
All right, Cara. Well, it was an absolute delight having you. And again, open to a part two if there's anything that comes up that you'd want to talk
Yeah.
about.
Same.
Yeah.
And just to briefly a plug, I'm the admin for two of the satellite groups for the main Excursion Science group. So if anybody's interested in joining a women's group, I'm an admin for the and actually the founder, of the XCS women's group, and also admin and member of the group for atheists, agnostics, humanists. Um, so those are some really good sources of community if
Yeah.
anybody is looking for something like that as they're leaving CS.
Yeah. Are those public groups that people can just find and then join with some
The
questions or something?
the women's group is a secret group. Um, But if somebody wants in, if they're in the main CS group, they can find me in
Okay.
the main XCS group, and I will add them. I'm not sure about the atheist off the top of my head. They both have, or the atheist group has questions that you have to answer before you can be admitted. So, but the women's group does not.
Hmm.
So
Okay. Yeah, I don't even think I'm in the women's group. I need to join that one.
I don't think you are.
That one got by me.
Yep. Hey,
I'm
if
in the
you want to
parenting
join.
one, the atheist one, the regular. I'm in all the groups.
Yep. Yep. I know. If you want to join, let me know.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Cara.
Thank you.
Talk to you next time. Thanks for listening to Leaving Christian Science. Disclaimer, I'm not an expert, I'm not a historian, I'm not a therapist, I'm just an ordinary, imperfect human who had the misfortune of being born into Christian Science. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and do not necessarily represent those of the host. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional, medical, legal, or psychiatric advice.